I hope you will all stay with us to the bitter end, and we'll have a wonderful reception as soon as the performance, which will last about 30 minutes, is over here at the end of the day. So after the concurrent sessions, come join us back in here for a little celebration. The next session I've been looking forward to is kind of a bookend for how the forum began, and Andy Revkin has joined us here to moderate this session. Andy, as you know, has 25 years of experience as a journalist, one of the leading journalists in environment and climate change for the last 25 years. He's now with Earth.com, his blogging sphere, and he will lead us in this discussion of stewardship in the Anthropocene.
Great, thank you. So it's great to be here, and I wish I had my computer in my lap so I could take notes, because this is a rare assemblage of people to talk about this really uncomfortable and exciting and scary moment we're at as a species. And this is a special moment. There's a guy named Stuart Hart, a professor at Cornell, who I saw speak last year at an event, and he talked about this concept in that historians have called Chrono Centrism, which is that basically every era, every generation feels its time is the special time in our history. I'm sure people felt that way when the founding fathers were scribbling. But now, as he said, and I agree, we really are at a unique juncture. Chronocentrism is not a fiction for this moment. We spent all this time as a species, and you've heard some of this illuminated here in earlier sessions, kind of getting by and just sort of hanging out. And in 1800, we made this slow rise in our global population to about 1 billion people on planet Earth in 1800. Now there's 1 billion teenagers on planet Earth. Just teenagers. And when I talk to teenagers about this, they get scared. The idea that there's 1 billion teenagers running around the planet right now. So the consequences, the opportunities, the situations that face those kids right now will in an unparalleled way shape the world for decades to come. And we're at this point where we've been sort of building a cresting wave of both numbers of people and our appetites. And that wave is going to break on a beach. Shortly, within 2 generations. We all are lucky enough. I think there is luck in this. It's not the scare factor gets outweighed by the opportunity and the excitement. We happen to be alive at this moment when, after this hundreds of thousands of years of just sort of skimming along, surviving, then this fossil-fueled explosion, moving to a new kind of relationship with the planet, either because it will enforce that upon us or we will choose our path. So we're talking about stewardship today. And the question is, can we outgrow our the traits within us that basically were on prime display these last 200 years? Or, as I've put it, I think I mentioned this yesterday on my blog on .earth. I did a piece called "Puberty on the Scale of a Planet" a year or so ago, which essentially was getting across this idea that we've been in this muscle flexing, cow tipping, frat boy kind of look what I can do mode for 200 years, and now scientists like the 3 here they're like the sort of the guy, the adult talking to the wayward teenager. You know, if you don't straighten out, you're in deep trouble. Now, can that message somehow be integrated and change behaviors? And what would be the menu? What would that stewardship look like? So we're going to explore that a little bit today. By the way, the image I put up here is just to reinforce one aspect of this reality, that the planet is increasingly what we choose to make it, including a lack of choosing is a choice. And often on my blog, I'll hear from skeptical people who say, oh, how could we possibly influence something like the oceans or the atmosphere? Well, this is to remind us, there's an illustrator in England, a science illustrator named Adam Neiman, who I wrote about on .earth recently, and he calculated very precisely the total volume of the world's waters, outside the stuff that's liquid. And when you put it in the form of a sphere, that is the volume of all the world's water. You know, I was lucky enough to sail across 2 oceans after college. And when you're in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles from land, 2 miles of depth of water below you, it certainly doesn't feel like a tiny little marble of water. But that's the reality. This is the world's atmosphere. If you took all the air from here through the stratosphere and had it at sea level pressure and made it into a spherical volume, that's our shared commons, the thing that we're now filling increasingly with emissions from our actions, which have consequences. So I just like to show this as a starting point. if you have that uncomfortable feeling or the skeptical feeling, how could we possibly do this? This, I think, helps get across that idea. Now, with us today, and I'm just going to briefly introduce them because they'll kind of lay out what they do, are some wonderful people to be guides. Jan Zalasiewicz at the University of Leicester is a geologist, and you might have heard from him earlier. He's one of the architects of this proposal that humanity has etched our record now in the geological record, that we need to kind of shift from this thing called the Holocene to this thing called the Anthropocene. And John Foley, next to him, is the director of the Institute for the Environment at the University of Minnesota. He's a longtime contact of mine on issues, all these issues, climate biology, and the interface of human action and the environment around us. Jerry Glover is an agricultural ecologist at the Land Institute and an emerging explorer for the National Geographic Society. I'd love to hear what that is, but that might be for another conversation. And he'll tell you about sort of human-altered biology, what we're doing to feed ourselves on a finite planet. And at the end, to sort of anchor us all in one of the most important questions about stewardship is Richard Cizik, who has had a long history of working with the religious community on trying to shape conversations about the environment. And you're now the president of the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, which is, again, when you look at our small planet here, you realize that idea that we are in a small place and we do have a common issue here to deal with. That's a vital perspective. So we want to start quickly. I guess you did lay out some of this in earlier sessions, but just remind us of the evidence that we're in, perhaps not only an era where we could say we're running the planet, but you actually would have a geological record of that. What's that all about, briefly?
Well, I guess, would that we were living in more boring times, but as you said, we're not.
No.
And the idea of the Anthropocene is it's not a new one. The idea that we're living in times which are influenced or dominated by humans has been around for a bit over a century. Ideas like the noosphere of Teilhard de Chardin and so on. And they were kind of taken seriously philosophically by a small group of people, but not by geologists, who for upright citizens that they are, said nonsense. How the great forces of nature are greater than anything that we can do or think of doing. So the term Anthropocene was actually coined by Paul Crutzen, who's not a geologist but an atmospheric chemist, in about the year 2000, so not long ago. And that idea was the first time this particular interpretation wasn't met with howls of derision from geologists. In fact, the reason I got to see the term was that it was being used by earth scientists in publications. And it was not formal, but it obviously had a chord. And the idea is that we have changed the oceans, the atmosphere, the land surface, and the biology of the planet sufficiently to leave a track, a trace in the sediments that are accumulating today, the strata of the far future, to be distinctive as a geological unit. So this is long-term change, something that can be recognized, let's say, 1 billion years from now, from the patterns that it has produced in the fabric of the rock of the Earth.
That's a pretty powerful concept. And so I guess, and there's a timeline on this? When will this be kind of adjudicated, or how does this work out?
Oh, very slowly.
Like the geological forces.
A geological timescale, as I said before, is something that geologists hold very dear. And any changes have to be decided upon by numerous committees who are very nitpicky about these sorts of things.
Right.
So I would imagine that, maybe in the next decade, some formal decision will be taken, but don't hold your breath, because the decision, let's say, over the Ordovician period, much simpler, much straightforward, took 20 years to make, to exactly define its boundary. That is the kind of order of time that is taken, simply because the world is very complicated. The world going back through 4.5 billion years is even more complicated, and trying to weigh up even the evidence that we can get hold of, to try and make some sensible decisions about quite how it changed and when it changed, does take time.
By the way, this is a tiny tangent, but in my decades of writing about climate change, I can't believe I can say decades, but it's true. I tend to sense that geologists have a higher threshold to cross for being convinced that humans are altering the atmosphere in meaningful ways compared to, well, climate scientists and even some people in the biological community. Is there, because geologists are thinking on these long time frames, like Bill Broad at the Times wrote a piece a few years ago about, well, you know, the CO2 in the atmosphere was at 5 times the concentration. So is that, do you get that sense? Is this a tougher
I think
crowd?
As a generalization, I think it can be said that we are insensitive brutes, by and large, in geology.
You don't look like it.
No, there is that, because we are used to dealing with catastrophe on a daily basis. You know, volcanic eruptions, mass extinctions. Let's say I deal with changes in strata, which involve the periodic suffocations of whole oceans. So when it comes to looking at what humans are doing, then the scale we have, the canvas we have, is innately bigger. And certainly when there were previous, if you like, environmental scares, let's say the acidification of some of the lakes in Scandinavia and so on, then geologists by and large were not, if you like, globally concerned about it. The time when I saw that changing was when global warming came along and began to be looked at properly. And that's the first time I saw my colleagues saying, this is looking big on a global scale. And that has then gone on to, let's say, the biodiversity crisis, acidification, and so on. These are now looking really quite big when measured against comparable events in the past, in the deep past of the Earth.
So, John, take us, one thing that's so interesting about even just the climate problem, not including the other problems of how do we feed ourselves and all that stuff, is so fundamentally multidisciplinary. If you're a lake a limnologist or you study lakes, you can remain comfortably in your realm forever. But if you're studying climate or the impacts of agriculture on ecosystems, you're in this realm where you're talking about geology, biology, chemistry, physics, and how has that played out in terms of just the tendency for people to accept where we're at?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was chuckling too about, the geologists are used to, literally doom and gloom, mass extinction. I was just kind of chuckling like, we're used to these big extinction events and smothering of oceans. So humans come along and they're like, no big deal. But, geologists are changing their tune on that. But it's same across other disciplines too. Ecologists, for example, tend to, just because of the history of ecology, tend to like to work on square meter plots where you can count everything and measure the species, and they're kind of struggling to work on a global scale. Atmospheric scientists tend to work on kind of fast timescales like weather, but over vast areas. So they were very good at this kind of thing. I was lucky, my early training was in astronomy. So I look at this and say, it's just one planet, no problem. Scale's not a problem here. We can work on a global scale, it's okay. But they do tie together. I mean, they're becoming increasingly irrelevant, which discipline you're trained in. We talked about this the other day in another panel, but the thing we need to do now is universities and academic institutions have done pretty well of discovering the stairwells inside the ivory tower. We can go up and down between geology and ecology and even, agriculture and other things. But we got to find the doors and the windows and get out into the real world and learn how to engage better the business world, nonprofits, faith groups, and others, and really form partnerships that way. That's where the answers are going to be.
And Jerry, when you study applied biology, essentially, I guess agriculture is applied science in the end. There's an end point. You want to feed the world. That's yet another realm. And when you're talking about stewardship, again, when we're talking about how do we, now that we have this strong sense that we are influencing planet-scale systems, and we know the trajectory of the human population is headed more or less toward 9 billion. It could be, 8 maybe. There's some signs of a lower fertility rate coming soon. But that's 2 more Chinas than the Chinas we have now.
Right.
And a lot of people now have insufficient nutrition to begin with. So how do you, and as we get wealthier, we demand not just adequate nutrition, but better, protein, meats, and stuff. When you look at this, how do you not sort of scratch your head and go, oh my God?
I don't know how to answer that question, but I guess the way that I keep going is somewhat to conceptualize it. And just going back to your drawing here, your image here, you have water and air. Yeah. But of course, when we think about humanity, mostly that's our focus as humans. What are humans going to do to keep ourselves alive without destroying the environment? And when we think about our flesh and bone, there's phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, potassium, nitrogen, so on, carbon. Well, we're missing perhaps the most important point here, soil.
Yeah.
How big is soil?
I'll ask
when
Adam. He'll do
It's
one.
much, much smaller. Yeah. Much, much smaller.
I'm sure.
And we're living and directly impacting it. We're obviously directly impacting the oceans and water too. But
by the way, the fresh there is one with a freshwater bubble, and you can barely see.
Right.
It. Yeah.
Soil is very small. Soil is generally measured in meters, not miles or kilometers. So the grand challenge facing us, one of the grand challenges, is how to harvest important nutrients from large landscapes, get it into edible form for humans without destroying the planet in the meantime. Just think how much phosphorus, if we weighed up the 7 billion people that are on the planet this month and calculated how much phosphorus that is, and that we need to keep that going, and it comes from soil. There are a few communities around the world that live primarily off of fish. Primarily, we're a terrestrial, agriculturally based civilization globally. So we're extracting these nutrients from landscapes and converting that into flesh and bone. One of the things that we need to internalize in the coming decades in terms of stewardship is what it really means when we're talking about food. The biggest challenge will be in providing those staple calorie crops, the big three of which are wheat, rice, and maize, and the other annual grain crops that include cereals, oilseeds, and legumes. That makes up probably 80% of our diet, our calories, directly or indirectly. And if I have just a moment, I wanted to lead it back to the earlier discussion of Cairo's waste collectors. So here we have a group of waste collectors out of a city of 20 million people. And I think T.H. Culhane's most frequently asked question is that scalable? Well, we can use some basic concepts in ecosystem science to address that question. So out of 20 million people, I did some rough calculations earlier during lunch, and assuming that, I just kind of pulled these out of thin air, starting with the 20 million. If the garbage collectors are collecting half of the organic waste from the city, so that's 10 million people they're collecting organic waste from. But of course, there's some inefficiencies and so on, so we moved down an order of magnitude. So now we're talking about 1 million people units. But of course, that waste isn't eaten directly by humans. It's fed through livestock, and then the livestock is eaten. And just basic concepts in ecosystem science, we know that moves us down a order of magnitude. So just by basic calculation, I estimate that a city of 20 million people wouldn't support more than 100,000 of the Zabaline. Is that correct? Yeah. And now I don't know how many of them there are in Cairo, but that sort of trophic level consideration is going to be very important. So then we ask, well, what's supporting the other tens of millions of people? It's the same thing that supports New York City. It's the same thing that supports the people in Beijing. Large landscapes growing the staple crops from which they're collecting soil nutrients and being transported to the cities. So the question, is it scalable? Yes. Every ecosystem needs this type of recycling organism, like the Zabaline. My favorite bird in Kansas is a turkey vulture, and I don't mean to, I'm not in any way disparaging the garbage collectors of Cairo, but the question would similarly be asked, are turkey vultures scalable? Well, in a sense they are. Every ecosystem needs something like that, but we're not thinking of an ecosystem composed entirely of turkey vultures. So we have to think in those broader terms of ecosystem science. and realize that we're really transforming soil into flesh and bone without destroying the basic support system that's able to supply those nutrients.
John had a point, but I wanted to ask you something else in a second.
Well, just to add to that a little bit, we actually come from pretty similar viewpoints on this, but from different angles. This whole food security problem, the differences between the size of the problem we face in feeding 9 billion people and the proposed solutions is almost infinite. It's incredible. The feeding 9 billion people, we're going to have to about double global food production between now and 2050, and that's not caused by population. Population will increase 20 to 30%, maybe demand alone. It's going to be changes in consumption, a global middle class diet emerging. That's what the real problem is going to be, plus population, of course. But the front seat's going to be mostly consumption. That's huge. Doubling food supply in 2050 we already use 40% of the Earth's surface for growing food already. And people talk about it, and they talk about GMOs, they talk about local food. Neither of those have anywhere near the answer. I'm sorry, I really wish they did. It would be great. But we're talking about vast areas of the Earth doing photosynthesis. City gardens and vertical farming and all that. You can't capture nearly enough photons in the laws of physics to produce even 1/100th the necessary food we're going to need in the future. We're going to need vast, like we do today, huge areas of the Earth's surface using a bunch of that drop of water on the Earth's surface and nearly all the removable nitrogen and phosphorus mobilized through the Earth's crust. It's incredible. Well, the systems that support our food now are unbelievable. And I'm a climate guy, so I'm thinking climate change is the big problem, but this is a much bigger problem, and our solutions are infinitely far away from scalability and real answers. Climate change is a much easier problem to solve, and that's scary. This is a lot harder.
Daunting. Actually, I was at a meeting here at the Ideas Festival a month ago, talking with Jason Clay and others about the idea of developing a set of wedges for agriculture. In other words, there was this an influential paper on climate. If you take climate change seriously, you want to stabilize emissions of greenhouse gases. That's not just the concentration in the atmosphere. That's the amount we put out each year, which has been climbing relentlessly. If you wanted to flatten that out as the first step toward a decline, which would be required to stabilize the concentration, how many things would you have to do in how many different arenas? Nuclear, efficiency, more efficient cars, less travel. And that is a monumental set of things that you would need to accomplish. And what I said to Jason, has anyone done an agriculture wedges paper? There was a paper in Science a few months ago by a team at Oxford that kind of laid out a path. But there, too, it's the innovation. Clearly, technology and innovation have to play a key role. That we were talking about Michael Pollan this morning, and he's a friend of mine, and he and others have propounded, and the Rodale crew have propounded for a long time the idea that, if we all just use the natural processes to enrich the crops and get the soil rich, and that we can get there from here. And then there's this other crew, Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University, who I recommend people read, who he says the road toward a green planet, a thriving, human-populated planet, is agricultural intensification, getting more and more and more production out of the same set of acres. And that will require technology, not just GMO, but, and we were talking about this morning. Jerry, you were saying that there's an idea that intensified agriculture is just putting more stuff on it. But you had a different vision of this.
Yeah, and I think it's a growing consideration and acknowledgement. So our current agricultural systems, in many respects, don't use all the sunlight that could be available to plants. They also are typically very poor users of water. So just for an example, many cropping systems in sub-Saharan Africa, I think Sandra Postel pointed this out the other day, are only using less than 30% of the available precipitation, but often they're dying of drought. So if we can develop farming systems that actually capture, store, and utilize for plant growth more of that annual precipitation, yields would go up fairly dramatically, and that's been shown. There's a variety of ways of doing that, but also extending growing seasons for crops so that we're actually capturing sunlight for the full growing season. In Kansas right now, there's 10 million acres roughly of just bare ground. We harvested wheat in late June. There's no living plant cover, and of course there's plenty of sunlight, there's plenty of soil moisture, plenty of nutrients available in the soil. We need to, one form of intensification is to use more of what's available, both deep in the soil and over the full growing season, so that we're not having to put on so much stuff. And that's a whole conversation in
Could
itself.
you just quickly touch on perennials? Just explain that.
Sure. Well, getting back to sort of the scale issue, a lot of the important processes that determine landscape health on large landscape areas are occurring at micro scales, nanoseconds, millimeters, and smaller. And humans, of course, evolved in the context of meters. A nitrogen molecule is like 12 orders of magnitude smaller than what humans evolved to deal with, really. So globally, nitrogen is one of our biggest issues with agricultural production. We're creating a lot of it, putting a lot of it on the land, and harvesting it, but humans don't do that very well. Perennial plant communities, and of course, those were nearly all natural plant communities, are dominated by perennials. The landscape around here, clearly dominated by perennials. Deep in the ground are the roots, they're the valves and regulators of these very small microprocesses going on all the time when the sun's shining, there's sufficient water, and so forth. We converted much of our global landscape to annual crops that function very differently. Roots are typically 1 to 2 meters shorter than perennials. They grow shorter periods of time, so of course that doesn't allow them to use the full sunlight, the full soil moisture and nutrients. And
so we don't have the luxury of that anymore, essentially.
Well, we're going to have to put up with the luxury of it, if you want to call it a luxury, for a while. But I think one of the great components for success over the next 50 years will be to increase our perennial options for agriculture around the world. Roughly 85% of native North American plant species are perennial. 15% are annual or biennial. With agriculture, we've roughly switched that. 85% of our croplands are annual crops, 15% perennials. We need to maybe not completely flip it back to natural plant communities in that ratio, but certainly change that.
Now, I want to shift the conversation more toward how to get information that scientists are aware of to change policy and change people's behaviors. But John, you look like you had something eating.
Yeah, just a quick thing was one other thing we need to look at. You can perennialize vegetation. I totally agree. That's a great idea. Look at intensification, not just as dumping chemicals and new genes on the landscape, but other things as well. But also asking what we use those landscapes for. If we look at the yield per acre, how many tons per hectare of stuff is generated by a farm field, you can get these amazing numbers in Iowa and other places. But then you ask, well, how many plate calories did you get out of that? That is, calories that showed up on a human plate that you could actually eat and go, yum, It's not so much in Iowa, after all, because it's going through a cow or pigs or other things that are very, very inefficient. Yeah. So, the local food thing, yeah, great, but diet changes alone would be a huge, at least a few wedges right there in solving the problem. So looking at, what do you get for the bargain? How much environmental damage are you causing versus how much human benefit do you actually realize through the whole system? We don't really look at agriculture that way, and we kind of need to do that now.
By the way, this reminds me of some of the most stunning literature I've read on the state of agriculture and food production around the world right now is the disparity between the best practices and I won't call them worst practices because that's judgmental, but the practices of a rain-fed agriculture person in Kenya compared to an Iowa corn farmer. And the numbers are unbelievable. It's like orders of magnitude per acre difference. And so assume that there's a huge opportunity to boost production in poor places.
Well, it's I don't know if John agrees with me, but that's more problematic than what it might seem. Differences in soil. National Geographic did a great story, Our Good Earth. Jim Richardson took the photos, had soil pits from 4 different places of the world, farmers standing over each one. The differences are pretty dramatic. Iowa cornfield, tremendous fertility, great climate, incredible infrastructure for delivering goods to and from the farm, incredibly well-trained agronomists, scientists, geneticists, everything you could possibly want. That's why those yields are up there. In other parts of the world, nearly all of that is missing. And even if, for example, as John was pointing out, we stopped feeding our Iowa corn crop to animals and started eating it directly, that would free up a lot of land potentially in Iowa. It may not free up that much land in Africa unless we're willing to just constantly ship food elsewhere. Food security probably is best not looked at as a single global average or sum, but we need to think in terms of regional food security. When, we can't just constantly be dumping our crops on other parts of the world, building that regional security up.
Although like Robert Mendelsohn, an economist at Yale, has done studies of African food and climate, where he said his conclusion is, remember, he's a macroeconomics guy, so he's thinking in broad terms. Move people to cities, get them employed in urban situations, and send the food from where you can grow it efficiently. That's another, in other words, he says that's kind of an approach to take that limits climate vulnerability, et cetera. I mean, and it kind of grates against a lot of people, that vision of how the world may work. But is that something that's you can just be discarded or not, that idea?
I wouldn't discard it outright. I think part of that may be part of the solution. But if we can raise yields in a way in these regions of the world most desperately in need of it, fairly easily, or over time, with some more difficulty, but keep people where they are, maintain their culture, let's do that too.
I want to ask you all, the scientists here, and this is shifting into the realm of ethics and values and how people perceive problems and act or not act. It would be great to have a psychologist up here as well, someone like Paul Slovic, but that's next year maybe. When you talk to neighbors, friends, or you interact on the web with curmudgeons, how much of this sense that we're at this special moment seems to remotely have been absorbed by people who are not engaged in the conversation we're having today?
It's, I find that on the whole, when you explain what is happening to a general audience, let's say the kind that you might go to the local village institute or something like that, then they're quite receptive to the ideas, because it's not rocket science. When you put the patterns and the numbers out and you compare them with fairly simple examples from the past, then there isn't a huge amount of wiggle room for saying what we're doing now is quite insignificant. And in fact, in terms of getting the climate change story across, what I found quite effective is simply going through the geological history of climate change and then coming to the present and saying, compared with the forcing agents we think we've had acting in the past, what is likely to happen now, without any, of course, degree of certainty about quite when and quite how and quite in what pattern. But I haven't found any great number of half bricks or rotten tomatoes coming my way for that. You always get, the good 5% of curmudgeons out there who you need to come and say, pick holes in the argument, and that's great. But on the whole, the idea has been widely received, even by curmudgeons in my profession also.
And the profession as
yes,
well.
I think the operative word there was my profession. Jan, would you agree? Maybe it was because, were you talking to people in your profession?
No. When I'm talking giving
general public,
I give quite a few talks.
You must be talking to different people than I'm talking.
Yes,
to.
Exactly. People who are not geologists, people who take let's say, the kind of people who take a general interest in local history or natural history or something like that, but have no geological background. So on the whole, I found that once you've discussed the idea with them for half an hour or so,
you're persuasive.
Well, I try not to be overtly. I just try and say, this is how it looks. Yeah. And there are lots of things we don't yet understand and things we have to settle. But the broad patterns, are falling out in a fairly vivid fashion.
Yeah, and Richard, actually, maybe I'll bring you in quickly and then come back to our friends in the middle here. Yeah, you've come at this from the vantage point of the outside world, looking at the science, and particularly from a community of people who believe in a God of one God or another, and one approach or another. And what's your sense of the lay of that landscape in terms of accepting where we're at, and that perhaps big changes need to be made in priorities and how the world, in charting a smooth path the next couple of generations?
Well, the challenge is that for 100 years, millions upon millions of Americans, it was quoted yesterday, 65 to 70% say they disbelieve evolution. You have, for 100 years, a war going on between religion and science.
Right.
And a significant percent of those people who are still holding that war in their hearts are discounting the science. And that's reflected in the political stalemate on Capitol Hill. And it's reflected in, I think, the failure, even in local communities, to come to agreement about what we do about climate change, which was one of the results of the climate panel the other day. It wasn't happening locally, so it couldn't be done in Washington. And so what's happening? I think there is a gradual evolution, for example. Did I say that? Yeah, evolution of evangelicals on the subject, especially the new evangelicals who already agree this is compelling. But just to give you one little snippet of an illustration, despite the position I took beginning in 2002, the position of the president of the Association of Evangelicals, and even the executive director, who was the former retired national commander of the Salvation Army, who has poverty as an agenda, right? So the top leadership is all saying this is true. And 4 or 5 years go on of our advocacy, our programs, our speakers, and our collaboration with the scientists like Eric Shivian at Harvard, all the rest. We poll the board in the fall of 2008, right before the election. And lo and behold, now these are leaders, mind you, of the evangelicals. By 2 to 1, they say they don't believe it's a compelling issue right now.
Yeah.
And they are simply a reflection of the general public who says, well, yes, climate change and these environmental issues are a problem. 70% say yes, over there, but not here. Only 16% say here.
There was a study. There's a study that's really useful if anyone wants to dig in a little more on this question of why people think the way they think about bodies of science and climate specifically. There was this study called 6 Americas, done by scientists at George Mason University and Yale, that I've referred to on the blog a few times. But if you just Google for 6 Americas and climate, you'll find a pretty rich assessment of, again, what the variance is on thinking about issues like human-driven climate change and what aligns with those views. And they range from dismissives, people, I'm sure you know some, who are utterly reject the idea that humans
know a lot.
could. I do too. Believe me, on .earth, I hear from them every hour. And I don't censor them, unlike other blogs, because I think you have to be honest to the range of views that are out in the world. The bottom line is, though, the social sciences and psychology work for years has shown increasingly that new information isn't going to make a dismissive become an alarmed, which is the other end of that spectrum of 6 Americas. And that, as a communicator, of course, is a very challenging thing to absorb. The reality that new information doesn't necessarily change things is very depressing. I'm sure it's depressing for scientists as well.
Well, it's why the scientific community hasn't yet persuaded the American public, and why we're at this stalemate, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's because people filter out what they don't want to hear.
Right, and they select what reinforces.
Selective reporting, and
There's
by the way,
it's called confirmation bias. That's the term of art.
By the way, it was the same group of leaders who were asked in the same poll, mind you. By 2 to 1, they said they don't believe it's real or compelling right now. When asked what they get their news from, said they were Fox Christians, in effect. I call them Fox Christians.
Have you? And, one thing that I've written about, though, and again, in terms of charting like a management plan or a strategy or a to-do list, given where we're at, close to 7 billion, heading toward roughly 9, knowing some of these trajectories underway, knowing that you're going to need new energy solutions, knowing that you're going to need fundamentally new agricultural and food solutions, and a lot of innovation, a lot of technological and scientific inquiry. When you look at the same polling, people who are dismissive of this concept of dangerous global warming you see the shape of the curve change completely when you ask them a question about, would you be for incentives for efficient vehicles? Yes, bing. So that when it's important, I think one of the key bodies of science that's been neglected in trying to figure out a smooth path for humans in the next 50 years is the science that's looking inward at us, how we think, how we behave, how we don't behave, and what drives us to change. And I assume you've all been thinking about this as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm glad you said that, because my own kind of more anecdotal experience as a scientist, so climate scientists, stop talking about climate change. We lost. Okay, it's over. Forget it. Talk about energy security. I can walk into a room of these Fox Christians. I'd much rather talk to conservatives than the Sierra Club now, because it's a lot more fun. First of all, you can go at it, and they're not expecting you. You know, they kind of want to disagree with you, and when they find you are actually agreeing, it kind of wigs them out. It's really fun. So I like to walk into rooms like that and say, forget about climate change. Do you love America?
Right.
And they're like, well, yeah, of course. You know, I'm like, well, doesn't it kind of tick you off that we, borrow money from China and send it to Saudi Arabia to prop up this energy industry, and we have dirty, pollution in our cities. It causes asthma. We're not secure. We're wasting money. We have deficits. You're pushing a lot of buttons that they happen to, push too. Yeah, they agree on that. Yeah. And that's the solution to the climate problem anyway. So why don't we just skip a step and get to where we actually agree? And when you talk to people, I found that you can get 90% agreement on, gee, we probably have to figure out how we're going to feed 9 billion people in the future.
And the poor.
Yeah. And there's an ethical imperative there that many people
are fundamentally decent. It's just maybe the skepticism around climate change has created a trap for us. Well, stop digging yourself into the hole. Get out of it and talk about it in a different way. Reframe the issue.
Yeah, in a certain sense, climate change is the victims of the origins debate.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, I remember what G.K. Chesterton was once asked 100 years ago. He was asked, well, what's the biggest problem in the world today? And he answered, I am.
What?
I am.
I am?
I am. And so I say to people, yeah, we need to rewire the energy grid, but we really need to rewire ourselves, our demands, our expectations, all of our consumerism. We need to rewire ourselves. And that can be done. And it just so happens that people change.
Yeah.
And I say, I've changed. And it's always best, by the way, when you get leaders at the top of various sectors of society, business, wherever, who are willing to come forward. By the way, this is sociologically proven by behavioral psychologists that you'll invite next year to the panel. They'll say, when leaders at the top say, I've changed my mind, they will change others.
Yeah, and boy, Obama could use a dose of that in terms of his approach to energy and climate. He's been very stuck in the approach that he started with, and he's yet to, and I switched to the opinion side of the New York Times as of 2 months ago, so I can actually sometimes say what I think. And I wrote a piece after the failure of the climate bill. Someone noted that I was criticizing Obama, and Joe Rome at Climate Progress was criticizing Obama. And I just want to be sure everyone understands my criticism wasn't, Obama, why didn't you push this bill? My criticism was, Obama, why don't you recognize the fundamental opportunity that lies in a new shaping of this conversation about energy, climate, sustainability as a forward-looking enterprise instead of a downward-looking negative emissions curb, cap and trade finance, make financiers happy kind of thing. And that's his failure, not that the failure to evolve, as you said. And I think he'd gain a lot of credence for doing that. And I also criticized him for not even bringing into his own conversation. The White House has not invited Jim Hansen to address the cabinet. Early in his administration, for whatever you think about George Bush's policies, he forced his cabinet. This is not like undersecretaries. He forced his cabinet to sit through 12 briefings with climate scientists in 2001, including Jim Hansen, including Dan Albritton from Boulder. And I wrote, I said, and I had no sense at all that the Obama administration had an open-minded question approach to this issue. Where do we go from here? Bringing in the leading lights. I don't know whether, do you see, I think generally with the environmental community, there's been this sort of stuckness with a 20th century model for these problems. It's sort of a woe is me, shame on you thing. And I'm circling back to your idea that the problem is here. The shame on you aspect was always Exxon's problem or some guy named George Bush, and when in reality the drivers of these needs for energy, for food, are how we live our lives.
Yes.
So is that what you're kind of getting at?
That's, by the way, I haven't been back to Aspen since 2005 when there was this summit. So everybody comes, the scientists like Hansen, Gus Speth and all the rest, the politicians, John Kerry and Al Gore, plus the environmentalists, everybody comes, and they invite a few of us from the religious community. So I wrote the paper on this. But we all left, interestingly enough, in 2005 with a conviction that we had to communicate to the American public that this issue wasn't just a green issue, not just a scientific issue, not just a political issue, but it was a moral issue. And that has been the most moving factor, I think, amongst the religious community and others, especially the conservatives, when they view this in a different way, to begin to shape the whole future debate. And one thing I can say for the Obama people, they may not always articulate it right or frame it right, but I do believe that inside, Mr. Obama gets it.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, I have to hawk my book. It's Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a new imperative for U.S. foreign policy, and it's free if you want a copy. It comes from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And what Obama has said through the National Security Council, I think what happened was the First Lady, who is a member of the Chicago Council, and by the way, to whom he gave his foreign policy speeches before he became president. I think the First Lady said to the president, do this, and he said, I'll do it. And so the order went to the NSC to create a joint task force, inviting everyone from DOE to the State Department, aid, everybody, saying, well, let's figure out how to engage communities abroad, because religion is a factor in the 21st century like never before. And it is shaping politics, culture, everywhere, in every country, into new political identities. And it's that factor, that religion factor, sometimes called, well, by the Washington Post, the God gap, that is an avenue for building these bridges of what? Civilian engagement in Afghanistan, right, with Muslim leaders on issues they care about, inviting to the conversation, yes, political parties, even like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. In other words, engaging not just diplomat to diplomat, government to government, but engaging the private sector in a civilian way across all these religion, cultural, social lines to say, together we can do this.
And from the science side of things, again, is there a discomfort factor with the reality that some aspect of this is fundamentally non-scientific? There has to be a values part of the equation. And we were talking about this a little bit at breakfast. I did a post for .earth a year or two ago saying, suppose Dan Nocera at MIT or Nate Lewis at Caltech, they nail it. They come up with the perfect energy source. So you can make a lot of food, give the fertilizer. So saran wrap cheap solar panels, and they don't kill ground squirrels or something. So you have the perfect energy source. We've done it, and does that solve the world's problems? And when you examine how that would play out, it clearly doesn't if you care about wild things, if you care about unpaved landscapes. If you only have technology and innovation, that may not lead you to a sufficient an outcome that people would think is satisfactory.
You need the care and concern. That is absolutely it's fundamental that people care. What is interesting, what I don't understand, is the relative spheres of the care and how much care and concern you put into different aspects. How much is local? How much is your family, your community? How much is your country? Or your group of countries, how much is the Earth as some kind of object? For instance, one of the, there've been a number of quite, arresting phrases in this meeting, which has made me think quite deeply. One of which is Sylvia Earle says we have 10 years to rescue the oceans, and by that, what she was meaning is that you have, let's say, particularly ocean acidification. If you get, let's say, to levels of CO2 of something between 500 and 600 ppm, likely reached somewhere between mid and end century, then coral reefs will simply stop growing, start dissolving, and that will be a major, major Anthropocene event. Now, the problem here is carbon, of course, in that. It's a fundamental restructuring of the Earth system. How do we get people to care about that? You know, the people who are good and moral and know right from wrong, and this is definitely a case of something which is a wrong that is being committed, that we're aware of. How do you get practical engagement in this sort of thing?
You don't, according to behavioral psychologists, you don't get people to change unless there is cognitive dissonance. You see this disequilibrium between their highest and best ethic that they believe in and the status quo. So there has to be that disequilibrium. They're uncomfortable with something that's happening in their own life or in the world that they see. And they're deeply unsettled by that. And they're given an answer, a solution that works. But you have to be really careful, because if you give them an answer that doesn't work and doesn't resonate, then you're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I worry a lot about the fact that, I mean, I think you're asking a question as a scientist, you know, and are you uncomfortable that this isn't just a science problem? Well, it's not just a values problem either, and it's not just a policy problem. We're not going to geek our way out. We're not going to wonk our way out. We're not going to wish our way out. We're going to have to do all of that. But we have to think of, I mean, we don't even have the right kinds of institutions to do this. We have these massive, large, top-down institutions that have just utterly failed. Financial failures we've seen recently, environmental failures, I mean, they're broken. You know, we need to throw out that whole idea. And they're not just governments, they're businesses, they're faith organizations, et cetera. And then we have the other extreme of the hyper-local, but that's not scaling up to the size of the problem either. We need something else, some other kind of networked way of governing and thinking and sharing values and you know, sharing technology. Maybe it's more open source, maybe it's more open values platforms, more collaboration across scales. And it's just a very different way of handling ourselves than we've ever imagined before.
We're going to go to questions in a couple of minutes, but Jerry, you had a quick thought here too.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of it, but maybe not. I'll take a run at it from a different direction. It's my impression, I think this is generally true, people of this generation are much more concerned about the environment, their impact on the environment and so forth, than, say, their grandparents' generation. But I also think it's equally, and so there's the values. They say that they recycle, they bike more than my grandparents didn't bike at all. But yet our environmental impact per capita is much greater than my grandparents' was. I think Dr. Walkernagel could probably answer this better than me, but years ago the EPA did a study of Sonoma County, a Sonoma County community, and to determine the ecological footprint of that community. They chose that community because it was a self-professed environmental community. They were concerned about their impact on the world. They biked more than the average person. They all recycled. They were very green in terms of their values and in terms of some of their actions. They were essentially recycling their way through 2 planets. In other words, if the rest of the planet lived like them, we'd still be burning through 2 planets. Even though their value system was right on, they were consuming far more than their grandparents, who didn't care a whit about the Earth in general. So, as we were saying this morning for breakfast, at breakfast, not for breakfast, but at breakfast, we, you know, from a scientific standpoint, we study other organisms in a much different way than we study humans. And maybe we need to shift some of the emphasis back. I'm certainly not saying get rid of or not consider values and ethics and so forth. I think that's very important. But when we study a deer population in crisis, we don't come at it from just only values and ethics. In fact, we don't apply that at all to deer. We go in and take empirical data. We do something to see if that'll change their behavior. You know, take notes on that. It's almost the Frank Luntz. We need to get the Frank Luntzes out of the political arena and get them into the environmental arena to see, you know, it's the behavioral psychologist's point of view. In other words, this whole environmental movement to get people to change their behavior has been perhaps overly focused on the difference between humans and other organisms, and it needs to shift back more to what commonalities we have with other organisms. We are asking ourselves to do what no other organism, to my knowledge, has done in history. We have more resources we can burn through, and we know that if we do it, we're going to destroy our support system. So we need to stop before we've consumed all the resources. Rats don't do that. Deer don't do that. limits will be imposed on deer populations and rat populations. They don't do it themselves. No other organism has done this in the history of the planet.
I just want to mention one analogy. I guess it's a metaphor. Analogy, yeah. I've written about this off and on, and this as a predicament. We are at this juncture that plenty of species have changed the world. Cyanobacteria filled the atmosphere with oxygen, as far as I know, right? I think it's mostly cyanobacteria. They weren't aware of that, and they didn't go, hey, cool, look what I did. So we're the first species in the history of life on this planet that has become a global scale force and is becoming aware of that. We haven't fully integrated that at all, I think, as a belief, as a true norm in our thinking about the world. So the question is, we're in a race between our potency and our self-awareness. How does that play out?
Well, in self-awareness, I've been told we're the only species that cares about whether somebody else has food. Isn't that interesting? Is that not true? Not true? Not anymore? Oh, okay.
Well, and you know,
Cool.
in the past we thought, well, we're the only organism that farms. Well, soon that was dispelled. Well, we're the only organism that mines nutrients from deep in the soil. No, they have elephants that actually have been mining salts for millennia.
Yeah, but,
on and on.
Yeah, but there are exceptions, of course. There are to everything. But generally speaking, if it's true that we are the only species that has some care for whether our fellow species eat, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that a bridge?
A bridge in
A
what
bridge
way?
to care.
Because
I say we have to
Well, it
think
implies, I think what's cool about that is it implies that as we look at ourselves more carefully, we can see that we have some of the toolkit that would be required to have a world where equity matters, where the disparity between utter poverty and utter wealth is something we act on, not just go woe is me about.
Yeah.
And so I do think that's a vital thing. And John,
Some of this I was just going to say is kind of funny. Is we all say we've even said it here how our generations here in this room are more aware of environmental issues than our grandparents, and that's undoubtedly true in terms of media and talking and thinking and all that. But if we could take the awareness we have with the way our grandparents actually did things, I mean, I grew up in New England where if it wasn't incredibly hard, then it wasn't worth doing. Okay, if you're from Maine, you get that. And people were self-reliant. They still had a real belief in what was the old American dream. You want your children to have a better world than you had. We've lost that. So the pragmatism of our grandparents, who maybe went through the Depression or earlier eras, and the awareness we have would be a powerful combination. But I find it kind of doubly sad that we have all this awareness, and yet the CO2 levels are continuing to go up. We're still using more resources as Americans than our parents' generation. We can say all we want about how aware we are, and shame on us. Despite that awareness, we're doing a worse job than our grandparents.
And that leads back to Jesse Ausubel, who I go to grudgingly as someone who thinks a lot and writes a lot about these issues and has for decades. And he has written, "The human mind will not change, therefore technology must." He's a very hard-bitten. He doesn't think we can do these things. I have a big chunk of me that feels that what Richard has said is true to some extent. It has to be, but in the end, it will be a mix of these factors. We're going to go to questions, but I wanted to really quickly, what are the traits? You were kind of saying that we're missing this governance or this sort of shape of things that would help smooth the path. And I periodically list traits that would help. Transparency, meaning so you're aware of the energy content of an apple. Resilience, which is the keystone, given that the most important things about something like climate change we don't know. We know the oceans are acidifying. We really don't know well how that will play out. We don't even know the range of warming. We know there's still a very wide range of warming from a certain buildup of CO2. So resilience, being able to act on the basis of uncertainty and have an adaptiveness is one. Equity, obviously, and I have hopes for how to make that happen. And innovation, the importance of science. Science has kind of been so dissed for so long, and I don't know how we can build the Apollo-style mission for these kinds of enterprises. But some people, the National Academy of Engineering has this grand challenges effort underway, which might be helpful, that kind of thing. I don't know if you have it. What's on your list? Like almost single words.
Are you asking me?
Traits, or what?
Well, I was simply going to say that we all have these rationalities, and we're not one. We're a combination. But we're individualists, hierarchicalists, egalitarians, and sometimes fatalists. And in some of the religious community, the evangelicals, they're all fatalists, they're individualists, and they're hierarchicalists all at the same time. That's a deadly mixture. No wonder they don't want to change. But I believe it's that human egalitarianism that says, I will care about other people and build those bridges. And commercial, the book is free. Yeah. By 2050, 80% of the world. And what are these religions? Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, they all say that we care about the divine. We will take care of each other. And thirdly, we care about the planet. That's, to me, an incredible collaboration with positive hope for the planet.
Yeah. So any last thoughts on what could help smooth the path? Some specific or notion?
Forbearance is one of them. We're quite an impatient society. I find the fact that we're dealing with a crisis of which, let's say, which can be at least practically addressed by, let's say, a good, proper carbon tax. And we're not institutionally prepared to think of it, in the Western world. We're not prepared to give up a small proportion of what we pay for fuel for something that we know will do a good deal of practical good. Yeah. However, whether the tax is hypothecated or not. So it's that letting go a little bit of what we have, I think would help.
Any last quick?
Well, I mean, the crux of this is, to me anyway, not in a very deeply spiritual or even thoughtful way, but humans have gotten along for millions of years doing what they do best, which is, get resources, bring them in, reproduce, do it again. We've been very successful at that. And when the Earth was basically infinite and we were really small, that was okay. But now we're really big, and now the Earth is looking really small, and that doesn't work anymore. And that whole dynamic of how we become successful, evolutionary biology is, arguably what drove a lot of human success. In that, go get stuff, reproduce, go get more. We can't do that anymore. So how are we going to find a new way to navigate? And you could argue our corporate and government and every other institution is essentially out to do the same thing: get more, protect it, keep it going. That's obviously broken. But I wish I had the answer to that. I don't. But I think a lot of what you just said about resilience and thinking of the future that way, risk aversion, and empathy as well, are going to be the keys. But we haven't really caught up. Our technology is far ahead of our wisdom.
Jerry, what's the glaring missing opportunity here?
I don't know. I think that I don't know if I have much to add other than a concern that we haven't brought up yet. So it's not addressing your question. Sorry.
Okay.
But I guess one of my great concerns as a parent is that a country like the United States is amazingly well buffered against many of the crises that loom in the future over the next 50 years. We have wonderful soils. We have a climate. We have weather patterns and climates that are maybe not going to be nearly as affected as some places. Plus, like I guess one analogy is if we're going to have to cut back on 2 meals a day, well, to the average American, we're still eating 4 if we cut back on 2. If you're only eating 3 meals a day and you have to cut back on 2, that's pretty bad. If you're only eating 2 meals a day and you have to cut back on 2, that's really bad. So as Americans especially, I hope the message gets out there. We don't want to become this privileged, buffered, insulated group of people while the rest of the world burns. I mean, that's a terrible cultural foundation. So I think that's going to be a challenge for us.
All right, so now let's start to find some questions out there. In the back there, and then you.
Actually, just wanted to address what you just brought up, which was one of you, I don't remember, brought up the idea that by 2050 we're going to need twice as much food supplies as we have now. The reality of how that's going to play out is everyone in all the societies in the world that have money will have food. Mm-hmm. And so we probably won't have a problem in a big way. And probably in the developing world, it'll be really segregated. The ones that have money in India and China will have food, and the ones that don't won't. I wondered if you all could comment about that.
Well, I'll just quickly say one thing. There was a study done in 2002, a paper called The Great Transition by the Anthropocene Institute and others. I wrote about this. We did a whole special section of Science Times on managing planet Earth that revolved around this paper. And basically, they set out scenarios. One of the scenarios for the next 50 years, 40 years is fortress world, where essentially the whole world becomes like Sao Paulo, where you migrate, the rich could go in their helicopter to their tower and back to their home, their guarded home, and everyone else is out there milling and in turbulence, and Africa is basically forgotten. That's certainly one outcome. Now, how do you get to the other outcomes is still a tough challenge. Unless you have a potent thought, why don't we keep rolling with some more?
Well, just one quick point. A lot of people bring up peak oil being a problem for agriculture. Again, no, not for. I mean, that'll be our top use of oil will be to grow food. Everything else will become optional. So I'm not worried about the peak oil food thing. That's a total waste of time to worry about that. Oil for other things is a luxury, not for food. But you're right. I think when push comes to shove, food will be a resource that wealthy will be able to get a hold of. But we have 1.2 billion people now who don't know where their next meal is coming from. It was only 800 million a few years ago.
More than ever in human history.
Yeah, the old-fashioned way of tackling this within a country, and I come from England where this has been a tradition, has simply been progressive taxation. And of course that, over the last few decades, has been diminished, so the gap between the rich and the poor has widened significantly, regardless of shade of government. And again, I just point out, between nations is a much harder thing, of course.
So the next one was there, and then the woman with the purple and green outfit.
Hello, yes, I just wanted to ask, given you all were talking earlier about some of the institutional failings, and given that most of our institutions are based upon sort of Enlightenment philosophy that man is somehow rational, and if anything, I would say the recent events have maybe shown that we're not quite so rational. So I guess, what sort of are your sort of thoughts on how, how maybe, I guess how would you say that our institutions sort of need to change and adapt, given that we don't seem to actually function the way that our institutions were actually envisioned by their creators?
Well, my own opinion, I guess the president spoke on this just a day or so ago. I'm not sure. My opinion is you can't count on lawmakers who are bought and paid for by industries to do what is in the best interest of the common good. And so change the system. If that means public financing of elections, by George, do it. It's not impossible. Common Cause, Bob Edgar's leading this. It's real, and it can happen, and it would change things. And so that's an institutional change that I think we're ready for as Americans, and would go a long ways to making it possible to overcome the reality that sin, and let's face it, when you've got the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, who up until the party switchover a few years ago was saying that climate change was the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American public. My gosh, when you've got lawmakers in key positions in Washington who are denying these truths, find a way to make it sure they leave. So I say, you want to change a light bulb? Great. Better yet, change a congressman.
Yeah. Again, the woman right there in the middle.
I have a question about whether we should stop talking about climate change. I mean, I can understand the point that you can get agreement at some abstract level if you start talking about energy security. But if you bring that down to more concrete policy, you can end up with the wrong answer, like, biofuels, for instance, where, they're clearly, what seemed like a good policy initiative that everyone could buy into at the beginning has resulted in a mess. So I just wonder whether stopping talking about climate change is a good idea. I mean, surely we have to stick to trying to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, since I was the one who said that, I should probably...
Take it back.
No, I'm not taking it back, but I'll mollify it a little bit. I mean, you're right in this sense, but I'm just saying, we've really gotten nowhere, and especially the way scientists have approached it has just been unbelievably bad. Global mean temperature, that doesn't mean anything to anyone because we don't live in global average places. What does a 3-degree warming on average mean? Nothing. What does it even mean to be? The temperature of this room will vary more than 3 degrees in the next hour. So talk about things that matter, like food, water, your way of life, the place you live. that kind of thing. So even translating climate change, I don't say ignore the issue, just turn it around. Reframe, that's all. Don't deny the laws of physics, please. But think about it from another angle. Let's say, by the way, even if you don't believe in the laws of physics, okay, but maybe you don't really want to have energy insecurity. Maybe you don't like to have funding of terrorists every time you buy a gallon of gasoline. I think a lot of people can find there's no downside to having energy security and alternative energy. I can't think of a downside. But getting stuck on the climate change debate has been very unproductive. So get around it, find another path. And I think you'll find a lot more people are with you than were ever before.
Right here in the front and then way in the back. So, do you have a, no, they'll find you. How many more minutes do we have? 5. Great.
This is kind of following up on the lady's point there. I am a bit concerned when you're saying, don't talk about climate change, focus on something like energy security, though. I mean, I think that's a good tack to take for a while because it's a new one, it's fresh, and it disarms people. I think that's great. But between what you're saying and what you're saying about, you can't change people's minds, so you have to change the technology, until another year passes by and you get your behavioral scientists up on the panel there, it sounds like you're giving up on people's ability to change their minds too soon.
They might be, I'm not.
Okay, well, that's my concern, though, is that's what it sounds like.
I'm the one who's saying people can change. That would be the one attribute I would add to your list. I said, well, egalitarianism, that's the capacity to think about others. And so I happen to think that, amidst those rationalities of the individualists, the hierarchicalists, and the fatalists, there is this egalitarian that says, wow, we should collaborate with China, with India, and let's find a way to do this. And we're all going to collectively manage getting over our pride, our arrogance, our apathy, and our greed. And we're going to do something for the planet and for everybody. And I am absolutely convinced that it's possible to do that.
Well, people have changed. In the past, we've had the civil rights movement in the States, the emancipation movement, but those have been very significant changes in the way that people have thought about each other and about the world. And I think we need another threshold which is comparable to that.
I would have cited the example of slavery. I mean, before that, of course, how people used to think slavery was fine. Now, except for a few unfortunate pockets in the world, that is gone.
And people will, in the future, read in history books about there were those people, in the United States who said this about climate change, just like there were people who took 100 years to overcome slavery.
Yeah, just because I seem to have sparked off a little bit of a negative reaction on saying forget about climate.
Just take it back, John.
Yeah, I'm not going to take it back. But I'll say again, if you want to get 10% of Americans to be with you, talk about climate change. If you want 70%, also add energy. And by the way, we have 10 years to figure this out.
And
so
by the way,
be practical, get it done.
And by the way, the only way to decarbonize a growing world is through an energy revolution. So it's the thing in the toolkit, along with some modulation of behaviors in rich places. But other than that, if you don't have fundamental, sustained, aggressive push on innovation and on diffusion of new and better energy technologies, you will not stabilize greenhouse gases in this century. And so again, focusing on climate crisis, we need a global cap on carbon. If that immediately turns off a big chunk of the constituency you would require to have as the only thing that will work, then that's, to me, a big problem. But we need to move on to one more question.
Oh, right there. I guess I'd like to start a fight. I think that we've got to talk about climate change. And the reason I think we do need to, I'm screwed, is because we can babysit the public that won't accept facts, won't think critically, or we can try and educate them. And part of the climate change argument is we've got to educate people on how to think critically, how to evaluate what's fact, what's fiction. And unless we do that, we're doomed anyway. I agree that deflecting it and saying, let's talk about energy is a very important thing to do in the short run, but in the long run, I have to ask a question. What do you think we should do in terms of dealing with educating people that don't think rationally so that we can have a climate change debate?
Well, the first answer is no, we don't think rationally. This isn't just 20% of the public. This is humanity. MIT, John Sturman did this really interesting study of this kind of problem. It's called a stock and flow problem. We're filling a bathtub, the atmosphere, with CO2 faster than it's being draining. And they gave a test to like 200 MIT students and faculty. They give them like a 3-minute primer on the basics of the problem. And they said, draw a graph of what you think emissions would have to do to stabilize the concentration in the atmosphere. And something like 2/3 got it wrong.
Oh, about 90% actually.
Yeah, he said 90% got it wrong. And so this is MIT. So the idea that there's some select group of whatever you want to call them out there who are impeding our ability as a society to get around problems that still are fundamentally someday and somewhere. Climate change is way more of an issue in sub-Saharan Africa than it will ever be in Aspen, Colorado. For many, many reasons. Read the Climate Divide series we wrote several years ago.
And of course, it's broader than that. The climate, which is a very important driver of the Earth system, which is why I think the Anthropocene is a useful concept, tool, metaphor, because it brings in climate change, it brings in biodiversity change, it brings in ocean, atmosphere, the whole lot which is happening and which we can test against the past. And that is, again, a useful device. If you've heard of dinosaurs, you understand the concept of the deep past, and therefore you can try and get some idea of the state we're in. Once we have an idea of the state we're in and where we're going, then we can think about how we can adapt, live with that.
And education and communication, experimentation, all those things are vital. Adam Neiman, this picture should be on every kid's textbook, basic Earth Science textbook.
With the soil piece on there.
With the soil part.
And the dinosaurs.
I feel ashamed personally that I spent 25 years writing, communicating about these issues, and this was created in 2003, and I only just found it this year through the miracles of the web. One last thought I wanted to communicate here is the merits of communication. I do think one of the great opportunities we have now that wasn't around at earlier points, when the Anthropocene was first conceived 100 years ago, is the power of instantaneous communication and experimentation, like this quantifiable ways to play with imagery, to play with ideas and new ways to jog us. And I just want to give you a little anecdote that will perhaps summarize my optimism for actually achieving some modicum of what was called noosphere, the planet of the mind, that ideas will move to where they're needed and things can happen in ways that we don't expect and that can come out with positive outcomes. I was in Istanbul last fall reporting a story on the inevitable earthquake that will wreck that city, or at least big chunks of it. And I was in a very poor neighborhood, typical, impoverished area, a lot of kids running around, and the kids were running up to me instead of looking at my camera and stuff. And instead of saying American or whatever, they were going, Facebook? Facebook? And I've said this here before. And then I went to this community center. They had a community center. These kids don't own computers, but they had this place they could go to play on computers. And they're all playing Farmville. So my kid in Garrison, my 12-year-old who's here right now, he plays Farmville. These kids play Farmville. The potential now for this global community to become a global community, for a kid in Istanbul, if you have an efficient translation interface, so that he's typing in, I want to trade you, I don't know, tomatoes. I don't even know what Farmville is. But he can engage in a conversation with a linguistic neutrality with a kid in Garrison, New York, in a way that was never possible before.
Well, if we could only just get the kids to actually farm,
well,
that would actually solve a problem.
No, I know. And there's so many more rich issues like this. Absolutely. And I did a piece, will Google Oceans save the real oceans? We don't know that yet. But I think that we're poised to have more positive things come because of this explosion of both ways to communicate. And by the way, for scientists to directly communicate, not just through the interface of someone like me, that I feel quite hopeful overall that we can kind of dodge at least some of the big bullets in the next few decades. And I really want to thank this panel for illuminating me. I'm going to be twittering on several things I heard here. And I thank you all for listening.